I'm Jenny Sherman.
And I'm Natalie Albright.
And this is CuriosiD, where WDET listeners ask the questions and we find the answers.
Today's question comes from David Perry, who wanted to know more about one of Detroit's most mysterious and eccentric record labels.
I discovered Fortune Records in a used record store, Encore Records in Ann Arbor, and I found a 3-CD compilation of 60 songs, and I bought it, and it turned out to be a real bargain. Here was a treasure trove of 60 recordings from the city of Detroit, from a bunch of artists I'd never heard of before, recorded in a studio I'd never heard of before. And it just seemed to me like a very interesting thing, especially since it's so close to WDET studios.
To help us dig deeper into this pioneering Detroit label that faded into obscurity, we headed to Hamtramck to speak with a man who literally wrote the book on it.
Okay, now we're recording.
Hi there.
Hello.
How are you?
How are you?
All right.
Michael Hurt is a writer, musician, and music historian.
It's all Fortune stuff here. This box here.
He co-wrote Mind Over Matter, The Myths and Mysteries of Detroit's Fortune Records, with his longtime friend, Billy Miller.
The nickname of it is The Brick.
That's David again.
Be prepared for quick research.
Fortune's story begins in the early 1940s with Jack and Devorah Brown, a young middle-class Jewish couple in Detroit who had hopes of breaking into the music business. Devorah was a talented songwriter and composer who dreamed of selling her music in Tin Pan Alley, New York's historic music publishing district.
After striking out with publishers in New York City, Devorah and Jack launched their own publishing company in 1943.
Trianon Publications was the name of their company, and Jack founded it just sort of like because he wanted her dream to come true, you know. And then they just started the label in 1946.
And just like that, Fortune Records was born. Without a studio space of their own, they recorded the label's first hit at United Sound Studios on 2nd Avenue.
A song called Jane Sweet as Summer Rain, that was the first Fortune record. And it doesn't sound like any of the crazy rock and roll or rhythm and blues or soul or hillbilly music that we associate with the label. But that's interesting because it's where they came from.
Devorah and Jack continued to make records at United Sound until 1951, when they opened their own studio on Linwood Avenue on the city's west side.
The minute they opened the studio on Linwood, they started recording everyone that came through the door, basically.
That included artists like the Davis Sisters, John Lee Hooker,
Let the teardrop fall.
Paul Lewis and the Swans, and Nolan Strong and the Diablos, a young vocal group attending Detroit Central High School, which was across the street from the Brown studio.
They just walked in there and wanted to hear what they would sound like on a record. And they basically pestered Jack and Devorah into recording them. And of course, that became, it was Adios My Desert Love, which really started the label off in rhythm and blues.
Devorah wrote many of the Diablos' early hits and was considered the creative force behind the label.
There's a certain mystique with Fortune Records, like an otherworldly sound. And part of it has to do with Devorah Brown and her Ampex 350 tape recorder, which she just loved the echo effects of.
The records themselves are mysterious. I mean, they were definitely thinking about the sort of sonics of making a record. They weren't just documenting it.
That's Detroit musician Matt Smith, who over the years has performed many times with two of Fortune's biggest stars, Andre Williams and Nathaniel Mayer.
I mean, The Wind by Nolan Strong, which is, one of the greatest doo-wop records ever, if not the greatest doo-wop record. It's just one of the most mysterious, supernatural-sounding records ever made. I mean, it's just weird.
The high tenors, we're not used to hearing that as much in music now. It's truly amazing. And the Diablos wrote that song when they were driving on Belle Isle, and they're like harmonizing sort of to the breeze, to the wind.
Summer breeze sends a chill down.
The etherealness, it's almost like he is the wind, Is this guy a spirit or is he real,
Andre Williams was the label's next major star, the Though he himself would say he was a lousy singer, he was a brilliant entertainer who masked his lack of singing skills by talking over his records.
While I was down in Tennessee, all my friends was...
Andre was really kind of ahead of his time with a lot of ideas, and his stuff had an enormous influence on the generation of rock and rollers that came after him.
The same could be said about Nathaniel Mayer, whose 1961 record Village of Love became Fortune's biggest national hit. But after a few bad licensing deals with larger labels, the Browns insisted on managing the distribution themselves, which proved to limit the success of their artists.
Their distribution, there was none. I mean, it was the trunk of Jack's car, literally.
In 1956, the Browns moved the label to a standalone cinder block building on 3rd Avenue in what was then considered Skid Row.
The label persisted for decades, but after the mass exodus following the 1967 riots, the neighborhood wasn't the same.
The Detroit of the 70s was so much different than the Detroit of the 60s. And after the rebellion, the riot, so much changed in the city that I think it was sort of a convenient time for Fortune to sort of go into decline.
The label began to truly fall apart in 1973, when Jack and Devora were hit by a car while crossing the street. Jack sustained internal injuries from the accident that eventually led to his death in 1980.
Devora tried to keep the label alive, but without Jack handling the business operations, it proved to be too difficult to maintain. The building was sold in 1996, shortly after Devora died. Despite efforts to save the studio, the building was demolished in 2001.
It never officially went out of business, which is interesting. It sort of evaporated into the ether.
Fortune records may not have lasted long in our collective memory, but it certainly had an impact on the music industry, and especially in Detroit.
Thanks again to our listener, David Perry, for this question. If you have questions about Detroit or Southeast Michigan, share it with us at WDET.org/curious.
For CuriosiD, I'm Jenny Sherman.
And I'm Natalie Albright.